"You weren't invited, Eleanor," Vanessa said calmly at the entrance of the ballroom, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. The words hung in the air like an unexpected chill in the middle of a warm summer evening. Eleanor Whitman stood quietly beneath the soft golden lights of the Grand Harbor Ballroom lobby, her hands resting around a small navy blue gift box tied with a silver ribbon. At 68, Eleanor carried herself with the steady dignity of someone who had lived a long life learning when silence spoke louder than protest. Around her, the lobby buzzed with quiet conversation, the sound of polished shoes on marble floors, and the distant laughter drifting out from the anniversary celebration inside. Tonight was supposed to be Daniel and Vanessa Whitman's 40th wedding anniversary celebration, an elegant gathering hosted in one of Boston's most exclusive waterfront hotels. Guests in tailored suits and shimmering evening dresses passed through the tall glass doors, handing their invitations to the young hostess at the reception table before stepping into the ballroom where music and champagne awaited them. Eleanor had chosen a simple pearl gray dress for the evening, the same color her late husband used to say reminded him of the Atlantic fog rolling over Cape Cod in the early morning. She had spent nearly an hour getting ready in her quiet townhouse across the river, smoothing her silver hair, choosing a modest necklace, and carefully placing the small gift box into her handbag before leaving. When she arrived, she had expected nothing more than a warm greeting from her son Daniel and perhaps a brief hug from her granddaughter Lily. Instead, Vanessa stood in front of her now with a composed smile that did not reach her eyes. "This is a private event," Vanessa continued politely, though the sharpness beneath her tone was unmistakable. Several guests slowed their steps, curious glances flickering between the elegantly dressed older woman and the poised hostess guarding the entrance. Daniel stood a few feet behind his wife, his tuxedo perfectly pressed, his posture stiff. He did not step forward. He did not speak. He simply looked down for a moment as if the marble floor beneath his shoes had suddenly become fascinating. Eleanor noticed everything. The hesitation. The silence. The quiet tension spreading through the small cluster of onlookers who suddenly found themselves witnessing something deeply uncomfortable. But Eleanor did not argue. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she gave the faintest nod, as though Vanessa had merely reminded her of a minor scheduling mistake. The small gift box remained steady in her hands. The silver ribbon reflected the lobby lights as she placed the box gently on the edge of the reception table. The hostess looked uncertain, glancing nervously between Vanessa and Eleanor as if unsure whether she should intervene. Inside the ballroom, the band began playing a slow jazz tune that drifted softly through the open doors. Laughter followed. Glasses clinked. The celebration had already begun. Eleanor rested her fingertips briefly on the lid of the gift box, as if confirming that it was still there. No one around her knew what was inside it. Not Vanessa. Not Daniel. Not even the curious guests pretending not to stare. And yet something about Eleanor's calm expression suggested that the evening was far from over. The music from the ballroom continued drifting into the lobby as Eleanor Whitman quietly withdrew her hand from the small gift box resting on the reception table. She did not rush. She did not look back at Vanessa. Instead, she stepped aside toward the tall windows that overlooked the dark water of Boston Harbor, as if she had simply come early and was waiting for someone else to arrive. Inside the ballroom, the celebration had already gathered its rhythm. A slow jazz melody filled the room while waiters moved between round tables carrying trays of champagne flutes that shimmered under the crystal chandeliers. Guests leaned close to one another, speaking in warm tones about old memories, business deals, and summer homes on the Cape. It was the kind of elegant gathering people remembered fondly for years afterward. Daniel Whitman stood near the center of the ballroom beside Vanessa as guests congratulated them on 40 years of marriage. His smile appeared practiced, polite, almost mechanical. From across the room, Vanessa noticed the navy blue gift box that had just been carried inside by one of the hotel staff. The silver ribbon caught her attention immediately. She frowned slightly. "What is that?" she asked the young hostess who had followed the staff member into the room. The hostess hesitated. "A guest left it at the reception table," she explained softly. Vanessa glanced toward the lobby doors as if expecting to see Eleanor still standing there. But the glass entrance now showed only the dim reflection of the ballroom lights. Daniel noticed the exchange and stepped closer. "What is going on?" he asked quietly. Vanessa forced a composed smile for the nearby guests before lowering her voice. "Your mother came," she said. Daniel's expression tightened. For a brief moment he looked toward the lobby, but the doors remained still. Across the ballroom, Lily Whitman had just arrived from the dance floor where she had been laughing with two of her cousins. At 16, she carried the same thoughtful eyes that her grandmother had always possessed. When she saw the navy blue box placed on the gift table, something in her expression shifted immediately. She knew that ribbon. She knew that careful way Eleanor tied gifts, with the edges perfectly aligned and the bow never too large. Lily felt a small knot form in her stomach. She glanced toward her father. Daniel had already picked up the box, weighing it slightly in his hands. It was heavier than he expected, but not large. Vanessa leaned closer. "It is probably just another sentimental thing," she said with a dismissive tone that sounded lighter than she felt. Around them, several guests had begun watching with polite curiosity. Opening gifts during anniversary celebrations was not unusual, especially when family members contributed something symbolic to honor the milestone. Daniel ran his fingers slowly along the edge of the lid, but did not open it yet. Instead, he stared at the ribbon for a long moment, as if the neat silver bow had suddenly become more complicated than it should have been. In the lobby outside, Eleanor Whitman had already stepped through the revolving door and into the quiet night air along the harbor walk. A cool breeze moved gently across the water and carried the faint scent of salt and distant boats. She paused near the railing, looking out across the dark waves reflecting the city lights. Behind her, the ballroom windows glowed warmly, full of music and celebration. Eleanor did not hurry away. She simply stood there for a moment with calm patience, as though she knew that somewhere inside that bright room a very small box was about to become the center of the entire evening. Daniel Whitman continued holding the small navy blue gift box while the soft music of the ballroom played around him, but the cheerful rhythm of the celebration had already begun to feel strangely distant. Vanessa stood beside him with a polite smile that had slowly stiffened as more guests began watching with quiet curiosity. The silver ribbon across the lid reflected the warm chandelier light, and for a brief moment Daniel simply stared at it as if the small box carried more weight than it should have. Lily Whitman moved closer through the crowd, pretending to examine the dessert table while keeping her eyes fixed on the gift in her father's hands. She recognized it immediately. Her grandmother Eleanor had always wrapped presents in exactly that careful way, neat edges, perfectly centered ribbon, nothing flashy, nothing excessive, just quiet precision. Vanessa crossed her arms lightly and leaned toward Daniel. "Well," she said softly, keeping her voice pleasant for the guests nearby, "are you going to open it or not?" Daniel hesitated. Something in his expression suggested that he already sensed the evening was shifting in a direction he could not yet see clearly. Around them, the conversations in the ballroom had grown quieter, the gentle background music now accompanied by the subtle rustle of attention as several guests watched with polite interest. Daniel finally slid one finger beneath the silver ribbon and loosened the bow. The ribbon slipped away easily and fell onto the white linen of the gift table. He lifted the lid slowly. Inside the box was not jewelry, not photographs, not the kind of sentimental keepsake that guests often exchanged during milestone celebrations. Instead, there was a thick cream-colored envelope, a small brass key attached to a plain metal ring, and a folded letter written on ivory paper. Vanessa frowned immediately. "What is that supposed to be?" she asked, the lightness in her voice beginning to disappear. Daniel picked up the envelope first. The paper felt heavier than ordinary stationery, the kind used for legal documents. Lily had stepped even closer now, her eyes moving quickly between her father's hands and the contents of the box. Several guests exchanged curious glances. One man near the bar whispered something quietly to his wife. Daniel turned the envelope over and noticed Eleanor's familiar handwriting across the front, written with steady ink, as if each letter had been placed carefully and deliberately. For a moment he did not open it. Instead, he unfolded the letter that lay beside it. The room seemed to grow still as he began reading silently, his eyes moving slowly across the page. At first his expression showed only mild confusion, but then the color in his face shifted. The calm composure he had carried all evening began to crack in a way that Vanessa noticed immediately. "Daniel," she said, a hint of impatience rising beneath her voice. He did not answer. Instead, he lowered the letter slightly and opened the envelope. Several neatly folded documents slid out into his hand. Even from a distance, Lily could see the official seals printed along the bottom of the pages. The same type of documents Eleanor had once shown Lily during a quiet afternoon at her townhouse when they were discussing family history and old investments. Daniel's breathing slowed. His fingers tightened slightly around the papers, as if the words printed there had suddenly changed the entire shape of the evening. Vanessa leaned closer and reached for one of the pages. "What is this?" she asked more sharply now. Daniel looked up slowly, his eyes no longer avoiding the room around him. Across the ballroom, the warm celebration lights continued glowing, but the joyful noise of the anniversary party had faded into a tense silence. In that moment, Daniel Whitman realized something that had never truly occurred to him before, that the small navy blue gift box Eleanor Whitman had left behind was not simply a present for the evening. It was a message, one that had been prepared long before this night began. Daniel Whitman continued staring at the documents as if the printed words refused to settle into meaning. The ballroom around him remained filled with elegant tables, candlelight, and the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, but the comfortable warmth of the celebration had slowly faded into a tense stillness. Vanessa leaned closer, impatience now clear in her voice as she reached for one of the pages in his hand. "Daniel, what is this supposed to mean?" she asked, her composure beginning to crack. Daniel did not answer immediately. His eyes moved across the legal language again, slower this time, as if confirming what he had just read was not some misunderstanding. The papers were property records, official and unmistakable, bearing the seal of the Suffolk County Registry of Deeds. The address printed across the top line was one Daniel knew by heart. It was the address of the large white colonial house where he and Vanessa had lived for the past 18 years, the house where Lily had grown up, the house where every Thanksgiving dinner and every Christmas morning had taken place. Vanessa grabbed the top page and scanned it quickly, her confident expression fading with every passing second. "This cannot be right," she said sharply. "The house belongs to us." Daniel slowly shook his head, still holding the letter Eleanor had written. His voice came out quieter than he expected. "No," he said. "It never did." A murmur moved through the nearby guests, subtle but unmistakable. Some tried politely to pretend they were not listening, while others simply stood still, their curiosity stronger than their manners. Lily watched everything from just a few steps away, her heart beating faster as the truth began forming in the air between the adults. Vanessa's voice rose slightly despite her attempt to remain composed. "Daniel, you signed the mortgage papers years ago," she said quickly. "You remember that?" Daniel lifted the letter again and finally spoke the words Eleanor had written. "The mortgage payments were made through a trust account," he read quietly. "A trust established by Eleanor Whitman 23 years ago." Vanessa blinked, confusion turning rapidly into disbelief. "That is impossible," she said. Daniel continued reading, his voice steady but distant, as if the letter had transported him into a memory he had never fully examined before. Eleanor's handwriting explained everything with calm clarity. When Daniel and Vanessa had first married, they had struggled to qualify for a mortgage large enough to purchase the house they wanted. Eleanor had quietly stepped in and arranged the financing through a family trust that she controlled. At the time, she told Daniel it was only a temporary arrangement until his career stabilized. Over the years, Daniel had simply assumed the property had eventually transferred into his name. He had never questioned it. He had never looked closely at the paperwork that arrived each year. Vanessa's face had turned pale beneath the ballroom lights. "This is ridiculous," she said. "There must be a mistake." Daniel lowered the letter slowly. The brass key from the box still rested on the table beside the documents. Lily noticed that the key looked older than the others on her father's keychain, heavier, more traditional. Daniel pointed quietly to a final paragraph near the bottom of the letter. Eleanor's words remained calm and direct. She explained that the trust remained entirely under her authority and that the property had never been transferred. She had allowed Daniel and Vanessa to live there because she believed family should help one another build stability. But the letter ended with a sentence that now echoed through the silent ballroom like a bell. Eleanor wrote that respect within a family should travel in both directions, and when that respect disappears, the arrangement supporting it must also come to an end. Daniel slowly folded the letter again, realizing that the small navy blue gift box Eleanor had left behind was not simply revealing a forgotten legal detail. It was quietly changing the foundation of everything he had believed about the home he thought he owned. The silence in the ballroom grew heavier as Daniel Whitman continued holding the documents, his fingers resting along the edges of the official papers as if they might somehow change if he let go. Around him, the celebration had quietly stalled. The jazz band had slowed its tempo, the pianist glancing uncertainly toward the crowd while guests pretended to sip their drinks and study the decorations rather than openly stare at the unfolding moment. Vanessa's voice returned first, sharper now, no longer softened by polite social tones. "Daniel, this is ridiculous," she said, gesturing toward the papers. "Your mother cannot simply decide something like this after all these years." Daniel did not respond immediately. His eyes drifted across the room, taking in the familiar faces of neighbors, coworkers, and distant relatives who had gathered to celebrate what was supposed to be a joyful milestone. Many of them had visited that house over the years. They had sat at the long oak dining table during holidays. They had walked through the sunlit kitchen that Vanessa had proudly remodeled. They had admired the large backyard garden where Eleanor herself had once planted the first rose bushes long before Lily was born. The memory settled slowly into Daniel's thoughts. Lily stepped closer to the table, her gaze moving from the letter to the small brass key resting beside it. The key looked older than the sleek modern ones people carried today. It had the weight and shape of something connected to an earlier time, something deliberate. Vanessa noticed Lily watching and straightened her posture as if trying to regain control of the moment. "There must be some misunderstanding," she insisted. "Your mother helped us with the financing when we first moved in, yes. But that was decades ago. Everything has been ours for years." Daniel exhaled slowly. "No," he said quietly. "We never transferred the ownership." Vanessa blinked at him. "What do you mean we never transferred it?" Daniel glanced back down at the letter, reading another line silently before speaking again. Eleanor's words explained the arrangement with calm clarity. The trust account had continued making the mortgage payments, while Daniel and Vanessa covered only maintenance costs and property taxes. Daniel had never examined the structure closely because the payments appeared routine, arriving automatically each month. It had felt ordinary, stable, unquestioned. Vanessa shook her head in disbelief. "That does not make sense," she said. "We have lived there for 18 years. Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes," he replied. "We have lived there." The difference between the two words hung quietly in the air. Lily noticed the way her father's voice had changed, as though a piece of the past he had never examined before was now unfolding in front of him. Vanessa grabbed the letter and scanned the final section again. Her expression tightened as she reached the last lines. Eleanor had written with her usual steady calm, explaining that the trust agreement allowed her to reclaim full control of the property at any time. She wrote that family generosity should never be mistaken for permanent entitlement. If a home no longer welcomed her presence, then it should not continue to benefit from her protection. Vanessa lowered the letter slowly, the confident smile she had carried throughout the evening now completely gone. Across the ballroom, several guests shifted uncomfortably, realizing the elegant anniversary celebration had quietly transformed into something far more personal. Daniel remained still, holding the documents as if they carried not just legal authority, but the quiet weight of years he had never questioned. On the table beside him, the brass key caught the chandelier light once more, resting beside the empty gift box that had arrived so quietly and now seemed to hold the power to change the future of the house Daniel had always believed was his. Daniel Whitman remained standing beside the gift table, the letter still resting in his hands while the quiet tension in the ballroom stretched across the room like a thin sheet of glass ready to crack. The jazz band had completely stopped playing now. Even the soft clinking of glasses had faded as guests realized that the elegant anniversary celebration had slowly turned into something far more serious than anyone expected. Vanessa folded her arms, her voice controlled but tight with frustration. "So what exactly is she trying to say with this little performance?" she asked, glancing toward the navy blue box that now sat empty on the table. Daniel did not answer immediately. His eyes moved again to the last paragraph of the letter, reading the words a second time. Eleanor's handwriting was steady and clear, the kind of writing that belonged to someone who had spent a lifetime organizing her thoughts carefully before speaking them. Lily stepped closer, her voice quiet but steady. "What does Grandma say in the rest of it?" Daniel looked at his daughter for a moment before lowering his eyes back to the page. Eleanor had written that the house had always been intended as a foundation for Daniel's future, not a permanent gift. When he and Vanessa were young and trying to build their careers, she believed stability mattered more than pride. She arranged the trust so that they could raise Lily without worrying about losing their home during difficult years. Daniel remembered those years clearly now. The long nights working at the consulting firm, the uncertain promotions, the endless effort to build financial security. Through all of it, the house had remained steady, almost invisible in its reliability. Vanessa reached for the brass key resting beside the letter and held it up between her fingers. "And what is this supposed to represent?" she asked. Daniel glanced at it. The key was slightly worn along the edges, the kind used for older lock mechanisms rather than modern electronic systems. Eleanor's letter explained that the key belonged to the original lock on the front door of the colonial house, the one installed when the property was first purchased through the trust. Years ago, Daniel had replaced that lock with a new security system, but Eleanor had kept the original key as a reminder that the property had never truly left her control. Vanessa placed the key back on the table with a small sound of metal against wood. "This is absurd," she said. "She cannot just decide to take everything back because she feels offended." Daniel remained silent for a long moment before speaking quietly. "She did not take anything back tonight," he said. "She simply reminded us who owns it." The words settled heavily in the room. Several guests exchanged uneasy looks, realizing the legal meaning behind what had just been revealed. Lily stared at the empty gift box, her mind replaying the moment earlier that evening when her grandmother had stood calmly in the lobby holding it. Eleanor had not raised her voice. She had not argued. She had simply left the box behind and walked away. Daniel folded the letter slowly and placed it back inside the envelope. He looked around the ballroom at the celebration decorations, the anniversary banner hanging above the stage, the photographs of family milestones arranged along the side table. Everything had been carefully planned to celebrate 4 decades of marriage and success. Yet now the evening felt strangely hollow. Vanessa glanced toward the entrance doors, as if expecting Eleanor to walk back in and explain everything personally. But the doors remained closed, and beyond them the harbor night continued quietly outside. Daniel understood something then that had never truly crossed his mind before. Eleanor had not come to argue, and she had not come to ask for an apology. She had simply delivered a message with the same calm precision she used when tying the silver ribbon around that small navy blue box, and she had trusted that the message would speak for itself once it was opened. Daniel Whitman remained standing beside the gift table long after the letter had been folded back into the envelope. The ballroom still looked elegant under the chandeliers, but the mood had changed in a way that no decoration could repair. Conversations had broken into small, uncertain murmurs. Some guests quietly returned to their tables while others pretended to examine the framed photographs arranged along the sidewall. Vanessa paced a few steps across the polished floor before turning back toward Daniel with visible frustration. "This entire situation is unnecessary," she said, lowering her voice, but not enough to hide the sharpness. "Your mother has always enjoyed dramatic gestures." Daniel did not immediately respond. Instead, he picked up the brass key from the table and turned it slowly between his fingers. The cool metal felt strangely familiar even though he had not seen that key in decades. Lily remained nearby, watching her father carefully. She could see the quiet shift happening inside him, the slow realization that the house he had always treated as his own foundation had been something far more fragile than he understood. Vanessa continued speaking, trying to regain the control she had carried earlier in the evening. "We have invested years into that house," she said firmly. "Renovations, landscaping, maintenance. We paid the taxes every year. She cannot simply appear tonight and pretend we have no claim to it." Daniel finally looked up. His voice was calm but noticeably heavier than before. "She is not pretending anything," he said quietly. "The documents are clear." Vanessa folded her arms again. "Legal documents can be challenged," she replied quickly. "We will speak with an attorney tomorrow." Daniel did not argue. Instead, he glanced toward the ballroom entrance, where the glass doors reflected the soft lights of the harbor outside. For the first time since the box had been opened, he seemed less focused on the property itself and more on the events that had led to this moment. Lily noticed that change immediately. She stepped closer to her father and spoke gently. "Did Grandma say anything else in the letter?" Daniel unfolded the paper again and reread a section he had almost skipped earlier in the tension of the room. Eleanor had written a few additional lines near the bottom, separate from the legal explanation. They were not accusations. They were not angry. They were simply observations written with the same calm clarity she had always used when speaking to her family. She wrote that over the past several years she had noticed the invitations becoming fewer. Holidays had become quieter. Conversations shorter. Visits postponed or forgotten. At first she believed it was simply the natural rhythm of busy lives. But eventually she realized something different had replaced the warmth that once defined their family home. Lily listened closely as Daniel read those words aloud. Vanessa looked away toward the far side of the ballroom where several guests now pretended to focus on their dessert plates. The letter continued with one final thought. Eleanor wrote that a house is not truly defined by ownership papers or trust agreements. It is defined by who is welcome inside the front door. If that welcome disappears, the building itself loses its meaning. Daniel lowered the letter slowly. The brass key remained resting in his palm, its weight no longer symbolic but very real. Vanessa remained silent for a moment before speaking again, though her voice now carried less certainty than before. "So, what exactly are we supposed to do now?" Daniel looked around the room once more. The celebration decorations still hung from the walls, the anniversary banner still stretched across the stage, but the atmosphere of the evening had quietly shifted into something reflective and uncomfortable. He closed the envelope and placed it back into the empty gift box. For the first time since the evening began, Daniel understood that Eleanor had not delivered the box to reclaim a house. She had delivered it to reveal a truth about the family that lived inside it. Daniel Whitman closed the small navy blue box slowly and rested both hands on the table as the weight of the evening settled over him. The ballroom lights still glowed warmly above the elegant decorations, but the celebration that had filled the room earlier now felt distant, almost like a memory that had already ended. Several guests had quietly moved back toward their seats, speaking in low voices as waiters cautiously resumed walking between tables with trays of untouched desserts. The music had not returned. Vanessa stood a few feet away, staring toward the ballroom entrance as if expecting Eleanor to walk back in and explain everything personally. "She cannot simply disappear after doing this," Vanessa said finally, her voice carrying a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "This entire situation is unreasonable." Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he picked up the brass key once more and studied it under the chandelier light. The smooth edges and worn grooves spoke of years that had passed unnoticed. For the first time he realized how many details of his own life had been quietly arranged by someone else, while he assumed everything had simply fallen into place. Lily stepped closer to him, her voice softer than before. "Dad," she said gently, "did Grandma know this would happen tonight?" Daniel thought about the question for a long moment. Eleanor had always been careful with her words, and even more careful with her decisions. She was not someone who acted impulsively. If she had prepared the documents, written the letter, and wrapped the box so precisely, then she had likely planned this moment well in advance. He remembered the calm expression she carried when she stood in the lobby earlier that evening. There had been no anger in her voice, no raised words, only quiet certainty. "Yes," Daniel said finally. "I think she did." Across the room, Vanessa turned sharply toward him. "So she planned to embarrass us in front of everyone?" she demanded. Daniel looked up slowly. "No," he replied. "She planned to tell us the truth." The difference between the two ideas hung silently in the air. Several guests who had been pretending not to listen now exchanged brief glances before looking away again. Vanessa shook her head and began pacing slowly near the edge of the dance floor. "We should call her," she insisted. "This can still be resolved tonight." Daniel considered that suggestion, but something in the letter had already made the answer clear. Eleanor had not left a phone number inside the envelope. She had not asked for a meeting or offered an explanation beyond what was written. She had simply delivered the documents and trusted that the message would reach them without another conversation. Lily looked toward the glass doors that faced the harbor. The water outside reflected the city lights in long silver lines that stretched across the dark surface. Somewhere beyond that quiet waterfront, her grandmother was likely already walking along the harbor path with the same steady pace she always used during evening walks. Lily suddenly remembered something Eleanor had told her once during a quiet afternoon in the garden behind the house. Her grandmother had said that the strongest decisions in life are rarely loud ones. They are usually the calm choices people make when they finally understand what they deserve. Daniel placed the brass key gently back inside the navy blue box and closed the lid again. Around him, the celebration decorations still filled the ballroom, but the meaning of the evening had quietly shifted. For the first time in many years, he realized that Eleanor had not been asking to be included in their lives. She had simply been waiting to see whether they would remember that she already belonged there. The ballroom remained quiet long after Daniel Whitman closed the small navy blue box for the final time that evening. The decorations still shimmered under the chandeliers, the anniversary banner still stretched proudly across the stage, but the celebration itself had changed into something far more reflective than anyone had planned. Guests slowly resumed their seats, speaking in careful voices while waiters moved gently through the room collecting glasses that had gone untouched during the unexpected silence. Vanessa stood near the dance floor with her arms folded, watching Daniel with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "So what happens now?" she asked finally. Daniel did not answer right away. Instead, he lifted the box once more and held it in both hands, feeling the surprising weight of such a small object. Only a few hours earlier the evening had felt predictable. Friends had arrived smiling, cameras had flashed, and the room had filled with congratulations for 40 years of marriage and success. Now the atmosphere carried a quiet tension that none of the decorations could hide. Lily remained beside her father, her eyes drifting toward the harbor windows again. The water outside reflected the city lights in long silver patterns that moved gently with the tide. Somewhere beyond those windows, Eleanor Whitman was walking through the cool night air, completely removed from the noise and confusion she had left behind. Lily thought about the calm way her grandmother had always spoken when explaining difficult things. Eleanor never raised her voice. She never demanded attention. She simply allowed people to discover the truth when they were ready to see it. Daniel finally spoke. "The house belongs to her," he said quietly. Vanessa immediately shook her head. "This cannot be the end of the conversation," she insisted. "We have lived there nearly 2 decades. Daniel looked at her with a tired expression that was very different from the confident smile he had worn earlier that evening. "Yes," he said again. "We have lived there." He placed the box gently on the table and slid the documents back inside it with careful movements. The legal papers, the letter, and the brass key rested together once more exactly as Eleanor had arranged them. Vanessa began pacing again, her heels tapping sharply against the polished floor. "We will speak with a lawyer in the morning," she said firmly. "There must be options." Daniel did not argue with her suggestion, but his attention had shifted away from legal solutions. Instead, he found himself remembering small details that had once seemed ordinary. Eleanor arriving early to help decorate the house for Lily's birthday parties. Eleanor quietly repairing the loose garden fence after a storm. Eleanor bringing homemade pie during holidays even after invitations had grown less frequent. He realized now that those gestures had not been reminders of ownership. They had simply been reminders of family. Lily spoke softly again. Do you think Grandma expected us to understand this tonight? Daniel looked toward the harbor doors for a long moment before answering. I think she expected us to think about it, he said. The room slowly returned to motion as the band cautiously began playing again and a few guests attempted polite conversation. But the anniversary celebration would never feel quite the same as it had at the beginning of the evening. Daniel closed the lid of the box one last time and rested his hand on it gently. For the first time since Eleanor had appeared in the lobby earlier that night, he finally understood what her quiet gift had truly contained. It was not simply a legal reminder about a house. It was a reflection of something far more important, the realization that respect inside a family cannot be assumed forever. It must be remembered, protected, and returned before the door that once welcomed everyone slowly closes without a single raised voice.